Okay, so today let's talk about vintage guitars. Do you need a vintage guitar? So I have people ask me all the time, like, should I buy an older guitar? Should I buy a new guitar? What's the pros? What's the cons of each, etc. All right, so at first I think you need to like decide on the difference between an old guitar, just an old guitar, and a vintage guitar. So buying just a used, maybe a guitar that's like 5 or 10 years old or something like that, you can find some good deals on stuff like that. And those are still relatively like new guitars, so they probably won't have a lot of issues. So I don't think that's really, for what I want to talk about today, I'm not going to really, that's not what I'm talking. I guess what I'm getting at is that's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about like a 3-year-old guitar or a 5-year-old guitar. I'm not talking about just used guitars, okay? We're talking about vintage guitars, stuff from, let's say like before let's say like 20 years or older guitars, right? So things from like the 90s or the 80s or the 70s or, something like that. So I have a couple vintage guitars. I have a couple newer guitars. The thing with vintage guitars that I think a lot of people need to understand is I think it's like something to aspire to. A lot of people, your heroes, your idols, they all use these vintage guitars, right? These vintage Les Pauls or these vintage Strats. And so you kind of aspire to that. And then a lot of times you get your hands on one and you hate it. And that's definitely like a thing. I mean, that's happened to me before. I've played vintage Strats that I just couldn't stand. I do not like vintage Strats. I like modern Strats. I have a modern Strat back here. This is my 2009 American Fender Strat, and I love that guitar. The neck is awesome. I don't like old Strats. I've played 50 Strats. I hate the necks on them. So that's one con of a vintage guitar, is that like you might not like it. It might just not be what you think it is or want it to be, I guess. Another con of a vintage guitar is they're super expensive. I mean, let's do this. This is my 1987 Gibson Les Paul Custom. Now, why would I buy this over a brand new Gibson Les Paul Custom, right? To be totally transparent, I paid $4,000 for this guitar. And it's almost as much as a brand new one, okay? So why would I buy a almost 35-year-old guitar over a brand new one for the same price, right? Because this was my dream guitar, okay? This is when I was born. I was born in 1987. And I wanted a birth year Les Paul. I wanted specifically a white custom. I wanted a birth year white custom. So if you have something like that, that's like a sentimental kind of thing to you, you're like, I want a birth year guitar, or maybe it's the year, like my kids were born, or something like that, right? Like you want something like that. Sure, right? A modern guitar isn't gonna like satisfy that thing for you. It's just not. The other thing is, this guitar, as you can see, has had the absolute crap played out of it, okay? And I've only had this guitar for 2 years, I think, 2.5 years maybe. So someone loved this thing. They played the crap out of it. And so that forebodes well. It's like, well, if somebody liked it that much, it must have been a good one, right? It must have felt great, had a great neck on it, sounded awesome. For someone to put that kind of, those kind of hours on it. Let's just hang it back up as I bang it into the wall. So I bought that guitar because it's what I wanted. I wanted that specific year, that specific finish. I wanted, and here's the thing, you can buy a relic, guitar, right? And it'll look great and it'll feel great. But as far as Gibsons go, with like their nitrous, their nitro cellulose finish, to me, nothing replicates this. 35 years of playing in and out of clubs and venues and stuff like that. The yellowing, how it's just faded and everything. Nothing replicates that to me. Like the way that feels is just incredible. So a modern guitar is not going to replicate that. But if you don't care about that kind of stuff, then, fair enough. The other vintage guitar I have is my 1961 Gibson LG1. Now, this guitar was given to me. My grandfather gave it to me. But this thing, as you can see, again, it sounds awesome. It feels awesome. And my granddad played this guitar to death. And I love this thing. But let's talk about some of the big cons of a vintage guitar, right? Let's start with the Les Paul. So when I got this guitar, it needed some work. Right, so a new guitar, maybe right out of the box, it's ready to go. Right, a vintage guitar, like I said, with this Les Paul, I had to do some work on it. I replaced the pickups, I replaced the electronics, like the pots and caps and stuff. It needed some work. It needed some maintenance. The same with this acoustic. This acoustic has, right here by the pick guard, like where the pick guard is like up against the neck, where the neck comes over the top of the body, there's like a little crack about like this big. And I fixed it. And a couple years later, it comes back open. I fix it again. It comes back open. I fix it again, right? So outside of like putting some cleats up underneath it, if you know anything about repairing, instruments, putting some cleats up underneath the top of it and like really keeping it from opening, which is just, I could do that, but I'm lazy. So fair enough, whatever. But the guitars have some problems. I've had to have this refretted, this acoustic. It's been refretted. It's had a new nut made. It's had a new saddle for the bridge. I had to replace all of the bridge pins. The tuning keys are going out. They're 61. How long ago is that, right? A long time ago, 60 years ago, right? The tuning keys are 60 years old. And they're just shot. They just need to be replaced. So a vintage guitar, it's going to be really expensive. It's probably going to need some work when you get it. You're going to have to do a lot of upkeep on it. And the longer you have it, the more upkeep it's going to require. Think about it like an old car. It's the same way, same thing. Like you're going to have to replace parts. You got an old car, you're going to have to replace the radiator at some point, have to replace the alternator at some point. Like they require maintenance. So there's a lot that goes into keeping up a vintage guitar. That's a lot of cons. And if you are a touring musician or even just like a weekend gigging musician, it might not be something that you want to deal with, right? Like every other week you got, oh man, the 50-year-old pots in my guitar are dying, or like the pickups are dying. I've had old pickups. I've had other guitars with like old vintage pickups in them, and the pickups just die. The magnets get weak, the pickups die. You have to replace them. I mean, things happen. With a more modern guitar, you might have to worry about all that stuff. So it really just depends. I don't think one's better than the other. I think it really just depends on what you're looking for. If you're looking for like an old played-in guitar, you want that feel, you want that look, the story that comes with it, the vibe, there's a whole vibe to vintage guitars, right? If that's what you want, then nothing's going to replicate that. A brand new relic guitar it's not going to replicate that. It's just not. But if you're just looking for something like utilitarian, you just want a new guitar that stays in tune. You don't have to worry about it doesn't need a refret. You don't have to worry about the electronics. Like it's not super expensive, right? Then then just stay away from vintage guitars completely, especially vintage acoustics. Vintage acoustics are just like a black hole of issues. Like, the saying goes for like owning boats, BOAT, bust out another 1,000. It's like everybody I know that owns a boat, they're always fixing their boat. They're always repairing it. Vintage acoustics are like that. Even more so than vintage electrics. Like, there's always something wrong with a vintage acoustic guitar. The neck is, the top starts to sink, or the bridge starts to get pulled up. Something. Like, there's always something going on with a vintage acoustic guitar. So, if you're just looking for a guitar that you're going to be able to play every weekend or tour with or really, really rely on, like, don't go anywhere near vintage guitars. They're not for you. Like, just don't. I have more modern guitars. Like I said, I've got my Strat. I've got this Les Paul here, right, that are more modern guitars that I don't have to worry about any of that kind of stuff with, right? So, if that's what you're looking for, I'll be the first person to tell you, don't buy a vintage guitar. Don't buy a vintage guitar just because someone tells you, oh, you need to buy a vintage guitar. Like, you don't. You absolutely do not need a vintage guitar. If you want one, then by all means, like, find the one you want, find the one that's for you, put the work into it, bring it back to where it needs to be, and it will scratch an itch unlike anything else will. Again, I love some of my more modern guitars, the Strat, this other Les Paul, I love them, but they just do not do for me like what these vintage guitars do. Like, there's something about playing them that's just awesome, that I just absolutely love. And when I take them to a show, people are always asking me about them. People want to know about them, know the story, know where they came from. Like, it's just there's so much other stuff about a vintage guitar than just, does it play good or whatever, right? There's so many other things that come along with it that I really like, all that stuff, the story of them and everything like that. So that's what I like about vintage guitars. Again, if you don't care about any of that kind of stuff, that like sentimentalness or whatever, then don't go anywhere near them, because they're just a black hole of problems, like, all the time. So that's my take on like modern versus vintage guitars. If you're watching this video, thanks. Hit the subscribe button, all that, YouTube jazz, and I'll be back next week with something else. Thanks.